This morning I have two scriptures for us. The first one is from the Gospel according to Matthew, starting in chapter 20. If you'd like to read along in your pew Bibles, it's on page 697. It'll also be on the overheads in front of you. This is Matthew chapter 20, starting in verse 20. Listen now for the word of the Lord. Now then the mother of Zebedee's sons came to Jesus with her sons, and kneeling down, she asked a favor of Jesus. "What is it you want?" Jesus asked. And she said, "Grant that one of these two sons of mine may sit at your right, and the other at your left in your kingdom." "You do not know what you are asking," Jesus said. "Can you drink the cup that I am going to drink?" "We can," they answered. And then Jesus said to them, "You will indeed drink from my cup, but to sit at my right or my left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared by my Father." Now when the other 10 disciples heard about this, they were indignant with the two brothers. And Jesus called them all together, and he said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. But not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be the first among you must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." Second scripture this morning comes from the Gospel according to John. We're going to read chapter 15, verses 12 through 17. In your pew Bibles, it's page 764. Again, it'll be on the overheads in front of you. This is John 15, starting in verse 12. These are the words of Jesus as he spoke to his disciples. "My command is this: love each other as I have loved you. And greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. Now you are my friends if you do what I command. And I no longer call you servants, because a servant does not know what his master's business is. Instead, I have called you friends. For everything that I learned from my Father, I have made known to you. Now you did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you, so that you might go and bear fruit, fruit that will last, and so that whatever you ask in my name, the Father will give to you. Now this is my command: love each other." This morning, I've got a sermon for you that I have entitled Radical Love. I thought it would be appropriate on a Sunday where we're celebrating and remembering mothers to preach a little bit of a sermon on the topic of love, because the idea of love is definitely one thing I think of when I think of my mom and mothers in general. And this morning, as I was thinking about that and preparing this sermon, I also was thinking about different stories about mothers in the scriptures. And so the first scripture I read to you has a little bit of a story about a mom in it. It starts with the story of Jesus and his disciples. Now, this particular story is told in 3 of the Gospels, and it's a little bit different context in each one, and maybe one elucidates the other. But in Matthew's telling, these 2 brothers who are disciples of Jesus have a mother who's involved in their lives. Now, it's not often in your scriptures that you hear a story about one of the family members of one or more of the disciples. But it is true that as they went around the ancient Palestine, modern-day Israel area, they went from town to town, they would occasionally overlap the areas where some of them were from. And so you can imagine if you're from a certain area and you're in that general vicinity, you may have family members who know you who recognize you when you show up on the street corners and start preaching and teaching, when you show up with a man who people are looking for because his word's gotten around. Not only does he preach and elucidate the scriptures with authority, but he also is known to perhaps work miracles. And the biggest one of that being healing. And so people would come in the droves from around to be healed by this man who had a touch or had a word, was curing people of their ailments. And so, of course, if you've got a family member, a brother, a cousin, or in this case, a son, who's going along with this guy, when you show up in the town, you can imagine when they show up in your town, you're going to go see what's happening. And apparently, some of these disciples were keeping pretty close contact with their family in the midst of this, because these guys, their mom knew what was going on. So much so that when they came into town and she was around, it said that she went with her sons and took them before Jesus to ask for a special blessing. Now you have to understand, when she shows up with her two boys who have been walking with Jesus and teaching with Jesus and learning from Jesus along the way, this is a pretty unexpected thing. You have to remember that at this time and in this culture, women were seen as subsidiary to men. It's not something that I'm trying to advocate for here. I want to be clear on this. I want to say this is a historical thing. But at this time in history, it would be highly unusual for two grown adult men to have their mom come into a context and speak to their leader, their boss, their rabbi. It would be unorthodox, to say the least. And yet here she is, she's walking in, and she's got her two sons in tow, and you can imagine they must have been talking about this idea among themselves as brothers. And when they gathered with their mom when they were in town, they must have been talking about it maybe around the meal table, and mom caught wind of their thoughts and their ideas. She said, you guys need to tell Jesus this. You need to let Jesus know your ambitions. Perhaps some of you have had experiences like this with your own mothers. Encouragement of achievement. And so she took them to Jesus and asked the question. Now, the question she asks, from our perspective, may sound like one from like an eternal one. Let these two sons of mine sit at your right and your left in your kingdom. But what she's thinking of, and you have to remember the disciples themselves, all the way up to Jesus' death on the cross, we're still thinking of Jesus like King David. We're still thinking of Jesus in this world only. And they had in their mind's eye, you have to remember these guys were a little bit, more than a little bit in some cases, but radicals. They were expecting Jesus to come and overthrow the Roman rulers and set up a new Jewish kingdom in Jerusalem. And so when she asks, and she doesn't ask of her own, she asks because her two sons want it, for them to be sitting at Jesus' right and left, she's thinking, when you overthrow the Romans, when you raise up a Jewish rebellion, and these 12 disciples who have followed with you and helped you to raise up this rebellion, and when they're done overthrowing the Romans and you take back Jerusalem and you set up your kingdom from there, then out of your 12 who are your closest advisors and friends and who helped raise up the rabble-rousers to do this overthrow, I would like these two boys of mine to have a place of honor in that kingdom. A very worldly sense of idea. And Jesus throws it back at them, not just at her, but at the two guys who are his disciples. And he says, I don't think you understand what you're asking for. Because you think, and he doesn't tell them this, but he uses alluding words, you think it's going to be here and now, but can you drink the cup that I'm about to drink? The cup that Jesus drank, in another telling of this, it's the night of the actual Last Supper. Another way of thinking about it is whether it's his final drink in this world or whether it's his drink from the vinegar when he's nailed to the cross, or whether it's the drink of sacrifice, which is really what I think he's getting at here. That what they're asking for is something far beyond what they have their mind set on. That what their vision is far short of what Jesus' vision really is. And what the calling is, not just to sit at Jesus' right or left in the eternal kingdom, which he says he can't even promise them because it's not for him to promise, but to just follow after Jesus, to just be his disciple, to just be with him in that kingdom, in the true kingdom, requires a willingness to do something with yourself and your life that is not an easy thing to do. This morning, that is the topic that I'd really like you to hear about. That is the idea that I would like to preach on here this morning. And that idea goes something like this. You know, I'm preaching this partially on Mother's Day because while I know that no person in this world is perfect, and many of us have had mothers who are worthy of honor and respect, some have not, some struggle with the idea of motherhood for various concepts and reasons. I will say, by and large, one group of people who I have seen time and again step out of themselves, make sacrifices for at least their own children, if not other people's children, put themselves second, if not third, if not fourth or fifth, in a line of importance, sacrifice of their time, of their talent, of their bodily well-being, to the extent of doing it sometimes day after day after day. The one group of people who I have seen do that in a consistent way is mothers, in a way that goes to the extreme in some cases. And that idea, that concept of putting yourself second or third or fourth or fifth in a long line of who comes before you, that idea of sacrificing of time, talent, ability, even health and well-being, so that somebody else might be raised up, that somebody else might come to know that time, that talent, that love, that health and well-being. That kind of calling is really what Jesus is talking about here. Now, the real challenge, the real radical nature of this love, is that while mothers sort of instinctually, for the most part, do it for their own children, and often for the children of their kids' friends or family members or your friend circle, this call that Jesus puts out there is not just for our own families. It's not just for our friendship circles or the kids that are around them. It's not even just for little ones and young ones. This call is not just for mothers. This call of sacrifice for the other is core to what it means to try to follow in the footsteps of Christ. This morning, I'm going to connect this idea to the sermon that I gave last week. Last week, I preached to you an idea. I titled the sermon, Children of God. I challenged you with the concept that the monotheistic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are sometimes the most challenging, the most difficult people out there are our fellow believers in a one God concept. Some of the most challenging moments that are happening in our world around us are from fellow believers perpetrating harm, crime, murder upon fellow believers who happen to have a different version of that one God concept. This morning, I wanted to challenge you with the idea of this. I think often as Christians, we look around us and we ask the question of who is redeemed. We ask the question of who is a believer in Christ? Who stands with us in our circle of belief? Who can be defined as one of those who should see not just the pearly gates of heaven, but the other side? Who should stand with us in the eternal realm? I feel like a lot of times in this world that we're living in, we look at that as another way of creating an in-group and an out-group. Yet another way of mimicking the society around us, which wants you to be blue or red, which wants you to be in or out, which wants you to be on the right side or the wrong side, depending on whichever side you stand on. To have a binary good and evil in this world. And that our faith, our Christian faith, the thing that's supposed to not only bring us salvation, but the thing that's supposed to inspire us to live differently in this world than those binary concepts. The thing that's supposed to be a gift for us so that we might be a gift for others, instead becomes a thing that fits right in line with all those binaries. A thing by which we say, I'm redeemed, and those who are redeemed with me are in my in-group, my right group, my eternal, successful, good group, and those who are not are unredeemed, are on the outside, are the other, are the enemy, are evil. But the challenge, brothers and sisters, the real root challenge of our faith, the real challenge that Jesus was saying to those 2 disciples and to all his disciples when he gathered them together because the other 10 were pissed off when they realized what the 2 brothers had asked of Jesus and brought their mom in to ask of Jesus, a special place of importance. And he looked them square in the face and he said, first of all, I don't think you understand the cup that I'm about to drink. You all want to drink it, you will. But if you want to drink my cup and really follow after what I'm doing, then the ones who are great in this world are not what's great in the kingdom of heaven. The ones who are great in the kingdom of heaven, the ones who want to be first among those in the land of the true redeemed, of the true redemption, in this world must make themselves servants to others. The ones who want to achieve the highest heights that are available in this life must be willing to be slaves to those around them. Concept Jesus takes to the extreme. He tells them before he's about to leave this world in the Gospel of John that the version of love he's looking for, which has at its root the thing that unites us as a family in God's eyes, that kind of love that makes us people who are children of God, people who can be redeemed, is the kind of love that lays down its life for others. Here's the real challenge, brothers and sisters. Instead of looking at the world around you and just asking the question of who is redeemed in the past tense, this Christ who came into this world, who died for all of the people who have lived from time before to time to come to time right now, for all of the people who have lived, he asks us to look at the world around us, and instead of seeing a binary of who's in and who's out, to look at the world around us and see a vineyard full of fruit, full of potential. Instead of redeemed in the past tense, he asks you to look at the world and see who is redeemable, who has potential, who can be saved. And more than that, he asks you to look at the world and say, even in the most extreme scenarios, even when they seem the furthest away from you, even when they are your persecutors and the implements of destruction upon you, your enemy because they have made themselves that way, who among them is still redeemable? Remember in the scriptures that one of the greatest persons who came after the initial 12 to spread the gospel to all the world, to save in particular Gentiles, non-believers, non-Jews, who are most of us gathered here today, was first a murderer of Christians. Paul the apostle, the one who wrote most of the rest of the New Testament after these 4 gospels, was a murderer of Christians before he was redeemed. And why? Why, in the midst of his murdering, in the midst of his own making himself the enemy of God's people? Why? Because God could look at humanity, look at the dregs of what we can make ourselves to be, look at our own selves and the sin that each of us can dwell in our own lives through our own choices, and see redemption in the midst of destruction. I'm going to give it to you in a little bit more visceral example, and then this will be the end of my sermon. Most of you know that, I've been here now almost 3 years as your pastor, and for the 5 years before that, I was the executive director of a nonprofit in Over the Rhine in Cincinnati, Ohio, which functioned as the city's largest soup kitchen, among other social services that it provided. What a lot of you don't know, though you may have guessed, is that there were numerous days in that work that were not easy. The work was always challenging, but there were other days that went above and beyond. While most days it was just challenging work, there were some days where it was threatening work, where my life was on the line, where I had to choose whether or not to walk into a situation that I might not walk back from. I remember in the first week that I started there as an interim, filling in for just 3 months. And the first week that I started there, I don't remember which day of the first week it was, but within the first 5 days of me being there, I had to walk into, it was my job to help intervene when the proverbial stuff hit the fan and people were having a bad day, be it because of mental health, be it because of drugs and alcohol, be it because of just a feud, a lover's feud, a battle between friends that used to be friends, or just two people at odds because of the life stuff that was happening around them. And if you want to see more stuff happen, throw poverty into the mix, and you will see more challenge happen. And so it happened from time to time. And that first week, I had to separate a fight between one guy with a golf club and one guy with a pretty large knife. And in the midst of that conversation, in the midst of intervening and trying to prevent them from harming one another, there was whispers, and the guy who was more powerful was the guy with the knife, and he threw the other guy to the ground, and he had a knife in his hand, and he was ready to strike. And whispers of his friends and myself saying, "You don't want to do this. You don't need to do this." I'll tell you, friends, right now, in the midst of that moment, he could have easily, accidentally or intentionally turned that knife on me because I was within striking distance. I'll tell you that I stood there in the midst of that wondering if I would walk away. But I'll also tell you that within days after that, after talking with that man when he decided to walk off that cliff instead of make a strike, that man changed his perspective. That he came back and he talked to me because I stood there in the midst of that with him, because I talked him off the ledge, and he said, I think you're right. I think there's something wrong in my perspective. We debriefed on what was going on in his life and why he was turning to violence in the midst of that. And this man went from a guy who was willing to draw a knife and be ready to take blood to being a guy who helped me in future situations talk other people off the ledge. Redemption. Because of the willingness to risk. I remember another instance, another moment, when there were two women who I don't know what had gone wrong, but I've seen women get more violent than some men. And these two were wanting to rip each other's hair out and starting to do so. We're in the midst of this battle in the middle of the space, and I walked out between them with claws flying to try and talk them off the ledge and to get a couple other people to help in the midst of it. I remember the one lady was so angry that when I put myself in the midst of them, she turned her anger from the other woman to me. She was so violent in her words. I mean, I've been called all kinds of things that I cannot repeat from the pulpit. But she went down a litany of words and then spat in my face out of pure anger, right in my face, and wanted to hurt me. In that moment, after seeing red and biting my own tongue and letting myself calm down, I remembered what I was trying to do there. And I talked to her about what her choices were now after what had been done. I told her she would have to take some time off if she ever wanted to come back in that space, and she needed to honor the amount of time that it would be, and she did. She went away angry that day, but she kept the number of days. She came back the exact number of days that I told her not to show her face back. And she came back, and she walked into my office, and she apologized. She thought about what I had said to her that day. Even in the midst of her anger, something went through. She apologized, and she told me what she had been through in her life that had caused her to get to that moment. The other stuff, the baggage, the challenge with her kids, the loss of income, the living on the streets that had just bubbled up into anger that day. And she asked for forgiveness. And she told me how she wanted to be different. And I gave her the chance. And brothers and sisters, she was. Not a day since then has she reacted to a person that way in that space. She too helped talk other people down after that day. I remember another day when the guy walked in, he was angry. He was normally a very friendly, jovial guy. That day he was angry. And he threatened another man, and I forget the reason why they were upset with each other. But again, I heard the voices raising, so I walked out into the situation. I came to realize pretty fast the threats he was making were not empty, because that particular day he had a firearm on him, and he was looking for blood. And he told me as I was walking out not to get into the situation because he was liable to use it on me if I walked into the midst of it. But I walked in nonetheless. I stared him in the face and I said, "You may have a gun. You may have the ability to take my life or others. But you have to think about what you really want to be about in this world. You have to think about what kind of story you want told about your life. You have to think about who you want to be and what world you want to create. I challenged him as he challenged me with what he was really about. And I could see him sitting there thinking about it in the midst of what his anger wanted him to do, in the midst of what I was telling him he could be. He decided to go with what the possibility was of something different. Brothers and sisters, I would not have been able to do any of those things if I had not decided early on in that ministry one key idea. You see, after that first week and that first encounter with violence, I went home really struggling with the idea of fear. You see, I would go down there dressed like this professionally and park on different places where I could be a target of any number of things. I'd walk into a space where I intentionally had to go into the midst of conflict and try and stop it. I knew that statistically I was more likely to get hurt driving on the highway to or from, but in those moments when you feel it viscerally in your face, you have to also be aware that there's real potential for harm there. And that kind of fear, that kind of visceralness, that kind of regularity of it challenges you to think about who you are and what you are about. And what I decided early on, the conviction that God gave me, was he told me in my heart of hearts that even if my life was taken in one of those moments, even if the bad day came with somebody with a mental health crisis or on drugs, and they weren't thinking clearly and they couldn't hear my words and they happened to have a tool of violence and decided to use it, that even if that moment happened and my son no longer had a father or my wife no longer had a husband or my parents no longer had a son, that my life was worth the telling of that story. That I would rather that story be told about who I am than many others that could be. And more importantly, the lives of those that I was risking my life for, the people who were in the midst of those situations, were worth me risking my life. You see, those of us who have this gift we call faith, those of us who think we are in this camp called redeemed, have this gift for a purpose. It is not for the purpose of you having for yourself. It is not for the purpose of you just gathering your little clutch of your family and your friends. It is not for the purpose of just you seeing the other side of salvation. In this life, this radical call to love that Christ has put upon us is to use this gift of faith to risk for the benefit of those who might still be redeemable. Do you believe in this kind of radical love? Can you respond to this kind of call? Can you risk your life with a purpose of maybe saving someone else's? Who are you willing to sacrifice for? Who are you willing to die for? I think most of us would have a very small circle if we answered it truly. Christ calls us to think about the world around us, about the people around us, about even those who we struggle with as a field, an opportunity, a chance. Instead of who is in and who's out, who has the potential to be one of us? Who has the potential to stand among us? And more than that, who has the potential to be our brother, our sister in the land eternal? If you're willing to look at the world with a little bit different eyes, to let Christ's view take over yours a little more often, though you will never be perfect in this life, as none of us are, the Lord will walk with you. He will empower you and give you words in those moments when you have none going into it. He will allow you to rise up until that day when you rise up to see him face to face. Amen.